Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to DIA. I'm Jasmine Raymond, curator here at the DIA Foundation, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. Such a beautiful day outside. So that's wonderful that you made it here. As many of you remember, the discussions in contemporary culture were established by DIA in 1983, when the foundation moved to Chelsea back then and had a building across the street. And that series was quite popular among scholars. It was founded, conceived by Hal Foster, our historian, Hal Foster, in collaboration with then director of DIA, Charlie Wright. And the series ran into 1995. It was a beautiful union of scholars from different fields, and it came from an impetus of trying to bridge the conversation beyond visual arts, beyond contemporary discourses within art history, and to invite other thinkers from the fields of architecture, politics, journalism, even rock and roll. At one point, I remember that there was a discussion on that, contemporary culture. And that effort, it yields a number of publications. Maybe some of you have seen it. For a long time, from 95 to 2002, DIA had stopped the series, and it was when I joined DIA in 2009 that we reinitiated the conversation as to how to bring it back. And in part because of the need coming from artists, but also from peers from other fields, suggesting that the series had created an energy of debate, and this is what we're here this afternoon to do. So even though there will be two guest speakers discussing, also after their presentations, I encourage you please to engage in questions, because it is a discussion that it goes all around. Manuel Sirauki is DIA's assistant curator, and he will do the introduction of today's speakers, but we're delighted that we're all here today. Thank you so much, and enjoy it, and get involved. Thanks.
So thank you, Yasmil. Thanks everybody for coming for this second conference in the Monuments, Monumentality, Monumentalization series. So before I introduce our two guest speakers, Mabel Wilson and Mark Rakatansky, I would like to say a few words about the critical goals of this series and the importance of architecture and architectural theory in these matters, especially given the number and the complexity of contributions this field has made to the history of monumentality, which is, in a way, history itself. The program Monuments, Monumentality, Monumentalization, that I coordinate, originates in the recognition of an array of contradictory impulses at stake in the very possibility of contemporary monuments. Once again, I can help to elaborate on Alois Riegel's classical distinction and say that, on the one hand, the concept of monumentality is architectural in origin and in its endemic relation to scale, even when the object is not a building but a sculpture, a painting, a concert, a dance performance, or a novel. For all of these objects are edifices in their own manner. In that sense, the concept of monumentality is, in a vague way, formalistic. But at the same time, the monument, a thing that reminds, as Siegfried Giedion pointed out, and as Riegel had previously indicated, a document that is emblematic of a culture, the monument is also a thing so subtle that has no qualities. It exists as such in a context of significance and recognition, where anything can be seen as emblematic depending on variables of rarity and cultural singularity. As the architectural monument contains the anthropological monument, the cultural monument, monumentality increases exponentially. And meanwhile, as pop artists have exemplified ad nauseam, the emblems of our time are countless, and anything appears ready to be memorialized that is monumentalized. The question is then, how can we redefine and sharpen our critical judgment to assess not only the nature of today's monuments, but also the importance of their preservation, or even the urgency of their transformation? To put it roughly, how can we choose our monuments? We got a hint of a response to this question last summer when Thomas Hirschhorn presented his Gramsci monument in the South Bronx, curated by Yasmine Raymond, and an artwork and a precarious architecture encompassing multiple artistic and critical forms and multiple architectures. And currently at Dia Beacon, we can see a certain monument to contraception amongst Carl Andres Dada forgeries. But the question is certainly to be addressed in multiple contexts and times. If the luminous side of monumentalization lies in its potential to enact resistance, then I cannot find a better historical reference than Mabel Wilson's account on the foundation of Detroit's IM, the International Afro-American Museum, in the late 1960s, the precarious architecture of the mobile museum trailer matching the fragility of the ephemera contained in it. If circa 1940, the modernist debate on and around the new monumentality responded to the inadequacy of a conception inherited from the worst representatives of the 19th century, today we are pushed to examine the overwhelming number of proposals, reactions, mutations, and revisions that such a debate provoked in theory and in practice, but also the possibilities it opened and the questions it left away. At any rate, this has little to do with that pleasing, comfortable utopianism of the last decade that Giedion would have included in the category of pseudo-monumentality. It has rather to do with the speculative passion and the architectural impulses at play in any critical operation, and the permutation of all these terms, speculative impulses and critical operations and architectural play and so on. And the importance of these mutations and speculative possibilities certainly explains why Mark Rakatansky's book, Tectonic Acts of Desire and Doubt, seems so fundamental to us today. Amidst the growing crowd of pseudo-monuments, Siegfried Giedion had claimed that monumentality has to be seldom used and always tactically. It has to be rare. With Mark Rakatansky, we learn that not only it has to be rare, it also has to be deeply cooked, that is, deeply understood and critically processed. This is only an apparent contradiction, but the dynamism of contradictions is as constitutive of an edifice as it is of music or an idea, and of course an artwork, which, like the monument, has no predetermined qualities. I want to thank Mark for his subversively inspiring ideas and for being our lucid interlocutor since the very inception of this Triple M program. Many conversations with Mabel and Mark over the past months have brought us to this moment and to the end of my introduction. Those conversations help calibrate the distance between their approaches, Mabel's and Mark's, as well as the deep connections, analogies, and continuities of their investigations. I want to thank you, Mabel and Mark, for the generosity of your commitment and your uncompromising wit. Now, as you all can see on the printed schedule, we will start with Mabel's presentation. Then we will take a 15-minute break for more cookies and tea. Then we will listen to Mark's lecture, after which we will have a panel discussion where, as Yasmine said, you're all welcome to ask questions. And so I will now introduce the first speakers of the night. Mabel Wilson is the Nancy and George E. Rope Professor at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, where she is also the founding director of the Applied Research Practices in Architecture program, co-director of the Global Africa Lab, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Research in African American Studies. She also explores urbanization, new technologies, and globalization in African cities through her collaborative design practices, KWA and Studio End. Hope I said it right. In 2012, she published Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums, that I have here, and I absolutely recommend. And Mabel's current book project, Building Race and Nation, How Slavery Influenced the Civic Architecture of Antebellum America, will be published in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Mabel Wilson to DIA.
Thank you, Yasmine and Manuel, for that wonderful introduction, both to the series and to me, the first M. Okay, let me see. Screen. Oh, that's not what's supposed to happen. Let's see. Okay. So I want to thank Dia, Yasmiel, and Mabel for the gracious invitation, but also for reviving Dia's Discussions in Contemporary Culture series, which are on view outside, and I would encourage everyone to actually pick up the various copies. For me, these books, Vision and Visuality, Remaking History, If You Lived Here, Black Popular Culture, were my primer on cultural analysis and helped me resituate architecture within a complex constellation of social, political, and cultural forces. In fact, the volume Black Popular Culture was a part of a conversation series I was engaged in, I believe it was 1993, at University of Kentucky. It was the Committee on Social Thought. And we invited Michelle Wallace to actually come and talk about the volume and the conferences and some of the issues in a panel that was called Democracy and Democratic Theory that included people like Chantal Mouffe. So that's what I mean. That series was really formative to sort of the work that I'm doing currently and how I think critically about architecture. That period also, as well in the early 90s, was a formative period where I first met Mark Rakatansky, which I believe in 1994, and our ongoing conversations about a number of issues, including questions of representation, identity, race, music, jazz in particular, and various forms of cultural practice has also enriched the work that I am currently undertaking. But lastly, I just want to thank the audience for joining our discussion on this absolutely lovely Saturday afternoon, so I hope we will not disappoint. Okay. So if we were a people much given to revealing secrets, we might raise monuments and sacrifice to the memories of our poets, but slavery cured us of that weakness. It may be enough, however, to have it said that we survive in exact relationship to the dedication of our poets, include preachers, musicians, and blues singers. Thus wrote the late Maya Angelou. This is a quote that has appeared in several of my writings about the creative evocations of collective memory and history within African American cultural practices. For Angelou, it is the cadence of spoken word, stanzas, scats, call and response, instead of the frozen figuration of stone and bronze that reveals the past, its secrets. The history of Black America is not told in its architecture, but its temporal patterns of oratory. This is certainly not because Black Americans did not build, but rather because of first enslavement, followed by the spatial policing of Jim Crow, segregation. They could never claim space in order to erect the permanent monumental forms of civic and cultural architecture, except perhaps within segregated neighborhoods or in a temporary fashion. It is the latter, the transient buildings, that led me to what were called Negro buildings, temporary exhibition halls and expositions where Black Americans represented who they were and how they imagined themselves to be. This, what I termed a counter-public space and counter-public sphere, took shape out of a diminution of economic, social, and political rights and access under white supremacy. These counter-public spaces existed for days, weeks, and on occasion months before they were dismantled or carted away. Also enmeshed in that vast diaspora that produced by voluntary and forced migrations, recollections of the past traveled with people as they moved from space to space. My talk this afternoon will approach the question of monuments, monumentality, and monumentalization through a close reading of the work of the artist Carrie Weems, in particular, her series of photographs of monuments in Rome. Now, what interests me in her series, Roaming, is to discern whose significations of history does the monument evoke in the process of recuperating the past. In the social space of the modern city, how and who does the monument address? Does racial difference, which is fundamental for how history signifies, I will argue, recalibrate the space-time effect of the monument? Signifying Blackness. Figures of Africans also appeared in European sculpture for centuries. The allegorical muse Africa populate paintings and sculptures. In the US, particularly in the 19th century, abolitionist statues also featured prone figures of unchained, enslaved men and women to champion the cause of emancipation. Now, these were very, very small statues. The John Rogers in particular were available for purchase and could be within the homes of people who supported abolition. Now, one of the first monuments of an African-American figure was to Frederick Douglass, erected in the city of Rochester, New York, where the abolitionist had lived for 25 years and where he was buried in 1895. Sculpted by Sidney Lewis and unveiled 4 years after Douglass's death in 1899 to an audience of black and white civic leaders. You can see on your left, actually, this was the establishment of the pedestal. The bronze monument, draped in patriotic bunting, was the first one in the United States dedicated to an African American. Through his fiery speeches calling for an end to slavery that were published widely, Douglass and his likeness were well known. For example, Douglass's figure had appeared on the pediment of the first Negro building, designed by white New York architect Bradford Gilbert for the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition in 1895. This exposition is best known as a national venue where a young Negro industrial training head named Booker T. Washington delivered his famous Atlanta Compromise speech. The Sage of Tuskegee rocketed into national prominence, once held by the recently deceased Douglass, when Washington advised his race to continue to dutifully labor for their white employers, and to be accommodating to the rise of animosity and vengeance from their fellow white citizens. Cast in white staff, Douglass's bas-relief figure in the pediment represented the future of the race. So he appears actually in one of the small pendants, circular pendants. His figure represented the future of the race, which was learned and respectable, which would be learned and respectable. Douglass's robust visage was juxtaposed, this was in the other circle, next to an unkempt mammy figure signifying the past of the race as feminized, illiterate, and disempowered. Now, once the content of machine engines and needlepoint samples and other evidence of industrial training within the Negro building had been shipped back to Southern schools, churches, and association, the 10,000 square foot Negro building was torn down at the close of the fair in early 1896. Now, in the American Negro exhibit in Paris's Universal Exposition in 1900, a maquette of Rochester's Douglass Monument also appeared in the exhibition. A part of the American contribution to the Pavilion of Social Economy, the exhibition featured an extensive catalog of Black American progress. Its content included co-curator W.E.B. Du Bois's award-winning Georgia Negro sociological study. A benchmark of racial progress, the Douglass Monument, along with the Georgia Negro study, represented to a European and American audience that the American Negro had a history and a culture. And I think it's worth noting this was the first plate of Du Bois's Georgia Negro study. He basically shows the extent of the African slave trade, and he also historicizes in relationship to Georgia, where he's from, and where the majority of the population of Black Americans were living, but also within South America. So the diaspora is actually being temporalized, spatialized, and most specifically historicized, I think, in this first plate. So Douglass's monument represented to a European audience that the Negro had a history and culture, contrary to the degrading stereotypes represented elsewhere on the exposition grounds. Collectively, these monuments to Douglass served two purposes. One, to demand social equality, and two, to demand equal rights. The accomplishments of Douglass countered Euro-American perceptions that the Negro lacked the capacity to contribute meaningfully to the advancement of the nation as well as the race. To Black Americans, just 40 years after emancipation, his figure provoked a recollection of Douglass's demands for equal treatment and rights to its former slaves. Douglass, for example, had dared to chastise white Americans that the, quote, hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, cynically reminding them that what to the American slave is the 4th of July. The Douglas monuments in its various representational forms did what historian Geneviève Fabre has argued that emerged from Black commemorative practices, that were not just a memory of past events, but a memory of the future, in anticipation, she writes, of action to come. Thus, we can understand Douglas's monument as a political act to provoke and evoke historical consciousness. Fabre suggests that, quote, this is critical because of a people who were often perceived as victims rather than historical agents, end quote. In other words, these monuments to Douglas did not signify past events, but were also meant to evoke future ones for rights yet to happen. A former slave, Douglas's tiring activism before, during, and after the Civil War made him a celebrated or reviled figure, depending on what region of the nation one traveled. He was, however, a widely recognized figure because of the numerous engravings and photographs that circulated widely at this time. Now, Douglas was also keenly aware of the possibilities of this new technology of photography, and in fact gave several lectures on the topic. In 1861, Douglas delivered a lecture titled Pictures in Progress, where he argued that photography could depict the Black man as he really was, rather than how whites imagined him to be. Referencing the degrading and exaggerated depictions of dancing coons and mammies and boogeymen and Hottentots appearing in print media, on projects, and at entertainment venues, Douglas's point was these new images would radically transform these new perceptions. Now, at this moment, there was even a movement amongst whites in the South, beginning around the 50th anniversary of emancipation in 1910, to erect a large Black Mammy monument on the National Mall, in homage to a Southern institution lost after the Civil War. So Douglas saw the tool of photography as a powerful medium of self-representation, observing that, quote, men of all conditions may see themselves as others see them. What was once the exclusive luxury of the rich and great is now within reach of all, end quote. And this was a quote from Pictures in Progress. Now, what Douglas astutely recognized, as would Du Bois, was that these new technologies would be accessible by what was becoming known as the masses, the growing populations of cities that were becoming linked by new telegraphic technologies. With every monument erected by the abolitionists because of segregation, with very few monuments erected to abolition because of segregation, through photography, Douglas's celebrity operated on a monumental scale, with many Black Americans purchasing pictures of Douglas to hang in their homes and businesses. Cultural historian Deborah Willis would observe in the work of the photographers that Du Bois employed to compile the documentation of the Georgia Negro study that, quote, photography played a role in shaping people's ideas about identity and sense of self. According to Willis, photography, quote, informed the African-American social consciousness and motivated Black people by offering an other view of the Black subject. In a sense, photography was used as what Willis calls subversive resistance. So what I'm trying to argue here is that the photograph stands in for the physical permanent monument as a means of evoking an understanding of both the past, but also the future memory, the potential of the rights that were supposed to have come to the African American. Witnessing history. A woman donning a long black dress stands with her back to the camera. Stationary, she stands near Rome's pyramid of Caius Cestius, which dates back to the 12th century, to 12 BC, when it was erected as a tomb for a powerful magistrate and former governor of the Roman province of Egypt, hence the pyramidal form. Romans apparently had a crush for all things Egyptian at this moment. Dwarfed by the scale of her surroundings, the unidentified woman is pointed toward the Porta San Paolo, a large gateway flanked by two crenellated cylindrical towers stitched into the 3rd century Aurelian walls of Rome. Originally called the Porta Ostienses, the gate marked the southern entry of the road from Ostia into the city. In this image, other historical moments are rendered visible. In the mise en scène, the older, perhaps 19th century cobblestone street abuts the more recent asphalt edge of the roadway. Both surfaces have been painted over by the cross-hatching markers that orchestrate pedestrian movement through the busy intersection of the Piazzale Ostiense. Still a crossroads as it was in ancient times. Vehicles are parked just near the base of the Cestius tomb. The large black and white photograph, one mounted eye height, 73 inches tall by 62 inches wide, marks time. It captures a moment in the past, like that of the monument. It too can evoke a memory. But as a reproduction, the photograph as an object may not bear what Benjamin identified as authenticity in order for it to function as a time machine proper, what art historian Alois Riegel cataloged as age value. The photograph, Pyramids of Rome, Ancient Rome, is from a series Roaming by artist Carrie Weems. As a viewer, we see what she sees. Weems is, in fact, the woman in black standing in the image. We witness history, or perhaps more accurately, histories that relate a sense of time, that narrate and represent past events or phenomena. The juxtaposition of these monuments, the Travertine Pyramid, the brick and stone gatehouse, mark different moments in the architectural and urban history of Rome. The automobiles, the street markings, and the figure of the woman in the photograph also mark the present, or at least at the time of when the photograph was taken, a present moment, now past. It is in the viewing of the photograph that the present moment is marked. Rather than an object in space, suggests architectural theorist Mark Wigley, the monument is a preserve for time. Monuments evoke memory by holding previous time against the flow of the present. Monuments, for Wigley, are in essence time machines. The longevity of the pyramid and the gate, their age, but also their juxtaposition, conjured in viewers an awareness of the past, particularly those in the Renaissance who developed a keen interest in antiquities, whose study evolved into the formal disciplines of archaeology and art history in the 18th and 19th century. Topographer Giuseppe Vassi, for example, included an engraving of the pyramid and gate in his first book, in his first mid-century volume of Della Magnificenza di Roma, of Magnificent Rome, a primer on ancient sites that were popular along the Grand Tour, embarked upon by the European aristocracy who were eager to gaze upon what was being claimed as their shared cultural patrimony. Vassi's peer, Giambattista Piranesi, also included the Pyramid of Cestius, in his depiction, overgrown and sublimely overscaled, as part of his engravings of Rome in various stages of ruination. One might say that Piranesi's Rome is a time machine where the past subsumes all present moments. In both engravings, figures, some with their past to the viewer, gaze in wonderment at these sentinels of antiquity. For the 18th century viewer, the site, but also the engravings of these two historical monuments, made the passing of time visible, but more importantly, rendered the events of history knowable. Monuments institutionalized what Wigley observes as, quote, a certain sense of time, end quote, in the viewing subject, whose capacity for recollection synchronizes the past with the present. The woman in black, but also we, the viewers, witness history in the making. So a quick aside, My favorite example of how a circuit of memory works, in this instance one whose calibration of synchronizing past and present is off-kilter, appears in Christopher Nolan's film Memento. The protagonist, or antagonist, Lenny, whose amnesia renders him incapable of developing new memory, relies on portable mnemonic devices, maps, notes, photographs, and tattoos to discern whether something is truth or fiction. For me, what is remarkable about Memento is the nondescript, or rather unmemorable architecture of the hotel rooms, the diners, the doctor's offices, and the bungalows along Lenny's journey. These are places that do not evoke remembrance, they evoke forgetting. Weems's roaming series captures her at the threshold of several monuments of architecture, art, and landscape in Rome and around southern Italy, including several at the ancient hill town of Matera. Other photographs in the series related to ancient sites show Weems at the northern gate of the Aurelio Wall outside the Piazza del Popolo, gazing at the Basilica Santa Maria del Popolo. Piranesi and Vassi also depicted the piazza. So Weems not only traverses the history of the city, but also the history of art. Although not visible in Weems's photograph, in the center of the piazza, they're in Vassi in Piranesi's engravings, one can see the Egyptian obelisk of Ramesses brought to the city by the Emperor Augustus. In the chains of significations of history, the monument to a powerful pharaoh is claimed as a tribute to a Roman emperor that eventually becomes a testament to pontifical power that remade Rome in the image of the imperial ambitions of the Catholic Church. In an interview about the roaming series, Weems pointedly observed that, quote, architecture in its essence is very much about power, end quote. The other photographs of the roaming series are titled Mussolini's Rome. So she had a series of roaming called Ancient Rome, and then there is Mussolini's Rome. These show monuments to other regimes of power in Rome's long history. Weems wanders through the EUR, or E42, the site of the Universal Exposition of Rome, commissioned by the fascist Prime Minister Benito Mussolini for 1942. The Italian government erected the buildings in the period following World War II. Weems stands in front of the Palazzo, the Hall of Congress. She walks toward the equestrian statue adjacent to what was called the Hall of Italian Civilization originally, and renamed later the Hall of the Worker. These images within the series make clear Weems' critique of architecture in Monumentality, where one feels, as Weems characterized it, quote, the power of the state in relation to the lower subject, the general population. You are always aware that you are a minion in relationship to the enormous edifice, she articulates, the edifice of power. Fundamental to the monuments of Rome within Weems' photographic derive is the representation of power and the marking of time as history through the monument. In the series, Weems has queried, what is this relationship of power to you, and what is your relationship to power? How do you contest it? End quote. The monument is a recurrent theme, although an understudied one, in Weems's body of work. She is best known for her kitchen table series, where she uses a table to stage domestic performances around the themes of gender, sexuality, family, and community within Black American life. In these photographs, Weems performs various social roles engaged in a tableau of everyday life. The insertions of texts within the series introduces another cadence into the work, a voice track of sorts in the form of what curator and critic Franklin Sermons identifies as the poetic writings that recalls the vernacular in oral narration. This series was followed by one on the Sea Islands, Africa, and the Slave Coast, where Weems photographed the architecture of the points of capture, departure, embarkation, and settlement within the sphere of the Atlantic slave trade. While these photographs possess an ethnographic tinge of first encounter, Weems counters this quality through textual insertions that enunciate other possible histories. When viewed together, these three series stitch a geopolitical space of the trade in human space, in human flesh, that fill the coffers of emergent nation states, fuel the industry generating the wealth of Europe and the Americas, and produce the significations of racial difference that enabled modernity's narratives of progress, history, and civilization. Working more directly with the subject of monuments, Weems photographed in 2000 monuments around the United States, including the gleaming white Soldiers' National Monument on the battlefield of Gettysburg and the towering bronze equestrian monument to the Revolutionary War hero George Washington that sits on the grounds of Thomas Jefferson's State House in Richmond. These intentional monuments, to use Riegel's term here, were erected to remind the public of the necessity and the sacrifices of war. Weems's rendering of these historical monuments within their messy-day urban context and their national park setting mutes the signification of the patriarchal power and violence that built and sustains the space of the nation. Weems's almost deadpan approach neutralizes the bellicose figuration of these monumental ensembles. She mutes the synchronizing emergence of the past in relation to the present. Monuments and their multiple forms of intentionality were assessed by the Austrian art historian Alois Riegel in his essay, The Modern Cult of Monuments, written in 1903. First, editor of its journal, and then member of the Central Commission for Research and Preservation of Artistic and Historical Monuments, Riegel undertook a lengthy theoretical analysis to comprehend the various social and cultural implications of preserving historic buildings and monuments. So it was essentially a sort of survey of the monuments of the empire. In a developmental framework, Riegel traced how Europeans understood the past, in particular during the Italian Renaissance, when monuments were noticed, notated, and valued. Riegel charts the development of three forms of commemorative value: historical value, age value, and intentional commemorative value. First, recognized in the Renaissance, historical value, object valuation, was determined by a monument's state of preservation, its ability to resist decay and disfiguration. Historical valuation feeds the production of knowledge about art, history, and culture, and it's within the purview of the learned scholar. A second, more modern form of valuation, according to Riegel, is age value, wherein the past is made evident through the material decay of the monument, and how it, quote, rests in the obvious perception of these traces. Age value, Riegel writes, lays claim to mass appeal. Age value has always informed historical value, contributing to the theories of development where one epoch and style could be traced as preceding or following the third. So Riegel is essentially saying this later version of age value is a way in which these masses, the same ones that Douglas is referring to, can begin to comprehend what is past. But it's very different than historical value, which is typically rendered as judgment, as thought, as opposed to age value, which is more understood as a sense. Third, intentional commemorative value for Riegel is the most modern, a synthesis of age and historical value that, quote, aims to preserve a moment in the consciousness of later generations and therefore remain alive and present in perpetuity, end quote. The past, these types of monuments remain in an eternal present, or as Riegel writes, in an unceasing state of becoming, requiring continual restoration against the forces of time. So the intentional monument is continually being renewed rather than allowing it to decay. It is through the arresting of the perceptual passage of time that enables the viewing subject to recall and know an historical event, the asynchronizing effect of the monument. Thus, the monument is always modern, argues Wigley, because the temporal circuiting of past and present also gives rise to what Riegel described as newness value. Because the unfolding of time is foundational to Riegel's assessment of the modern monument, and it is steeped in 19th century notions of progress, culture, and history, all of which were produced through the category of the racial in racial difference. A witness of history. Now, the other trope utilized in the roaming series, that of the witness, can be found in Weems' series, The Louisiana Project, Beacon, and the ongoing museum series. This is Bilbao, this is the Tate Modern. Scholars have often compared the use of the figures in Weems' series to Caspar David Friedrich's famous painting, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. Friedrich's unnamed man gazes outward across a landscape that is visibly vast, but cloaked under a cloud of fog. It cannot be seen, and in that respect, the landscape can also not be known, but it is nonetheless beautiful to the viewer, or in the Kantian sense, aesthetically pleasing. Architectural historian Antoine Picon suggests that at this moment, landscape, territory, and also historiography shared a perspective based upon, quote, an estrangement from immediate experience. According to theorist Denise De Silva, the transcendental being of things in the world emerging from Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment philosophy captured, quote, a temporality of the knowing subject, acquiring their own historicity, a sense of the subject understanding his being in time. So I want to emphasize again the emergence of this sense of being in time and in history. As a photographic sequence, an almost cinematic one akin to Chris Marker's La Jetée, we follow Weems on her derive through the city and through various epochs of time. Her photographs operate as a monument of time-space, a future memory, a subjectivity that is still in the process of becoming within what De Silva has identified as Europe's onto-epistemological framework of history, the interior realm of the modern self-conscious subject, and the space of representation, an exterior space of the world. The monument not only evokes memory, but it also requires that the viewing subject engage the significations evoked by the monument's narrative of history. In other words, it constitutes the subject within history, and as a time machine, it places the viewing subject in time. De Silva cogently argues that this modern subject is both, quote, producer and product, and cause and effect, an effect of both scientific and historical signification. For De Silva, Europe's significations of history are productive of the universal humanist subject, but it also required a space of colonial encounter to produce difference signified in the rational discourse of science, that is, anthropology, racial science, and so forth. Weems's early series, From Where I Saw What Happened and Cried, for example, appropriated the mid-19th century daguerreotypes of slave taken by J.T. Zeiley for biologist and geographer Luis Agassiz to use in his research on racial typologies. Agassiz produced knowledge on racial difference that boosted national claims that the intellectually superior Europeans, and by racial stock also Americans, would lead civilization's vanguard, while the inferior primitive Africans, including Negroes, but also Asians and Native Americans, would labor in the world's rearguard. Weems's recalibration of the light and colors and her reframing of the images humanized the subject of the scientific gaze. Represented in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment periods as primitive, ignorant, illiterate, and asexual, can history be conveyed through history conveyed through monumentality be signified through the subjectivity of a Black woman? History, and in particular its post-Enlightenment representation, enables the formation of the modern subject, one that is no longer the subject of the church or the monarchy. In her rigorous review of a modern epistemology, from Descartes to Locke, Kant, Hegel, Herder, Darwin, and to the contemporary theorists of race, ethnicity, and subalternity, De Silva concerns herself with how the play of reason in these modern texts brings the thinking subject into representation through history and science. This begins, for instance, with Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," a form of subjectivity, a self-consciousness and self-determination radically different from one governed by God's will or the will of the king or queen. Found in the comparative racial difference made possible by colonial counters, this rational presentation of human difference, minds who think and bodies who labor, produces spaces of regulation and representation during the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment periods. So for example, Riegel's Austrian citizenry and his European audience, those who might have traveled the Grand Tour or visited the exposition grounds in Paris or London, or journeyed to the colonies of the empire, held a world view, or one might say a bird's eye view, that exceeded the geographical boundaries of Europe. The centuries of colonial encounter were productive of a self-determined and self-conscious modern subject. De Silva strategically fuses racial subjection with global subjection in order to demonstrate, quote, how the productive weapons of reason, the tools of history and science, institute both man and his others as global historical beings. One example of the global historical subject can be observed in how the racial works as history, to allow the conqueror to understand himself as being in a different time than the so-called natives he encounters. He records his encounter as history that documents the rate at which different civilizations have advanced. The racial also operates through tools of science such that the conqueror can survey and map and thus represent himself in the space of encounter as someplace different than Europe's others. Thus, at the beginning of the mid-19th century, Europe, and in different but parallel ways in the United States, the racial becomes an effective means of establishing social hierarchies through knowledge of the universal signifier of mankind. Modern systems of representation, such as treatises in architecture and drawings that deploy reason productively, were fundamental to the sciences that regulate exteriority, things in the world, and history that regulates interiority, or an individual's sense of self-consciousness. Comparative methods of form and evolution used in the biological sciences were adopted in architecture to determine differences in building function and style. Thus, the history of courthouses, or the comparative history of triumphal arches, could be known across time and adapted to the signification regimes of power for the emergent nation states. So to conclude, Carrie Mae Weems' Roaming is a powerful work that engages the architecture of the monument. One more. Its signifying capacity of history and power and ability, it bears a signifying capacity of history and power and also an ability to produce the viewing subject. The repetitious appearance of the figure in all of her large photographs, one that echoes the cadence of walking, where she goes, we follow, imbues the image with the pressure of time, what philosopher Deleuze describes as being, quote, what is specific of the image, as soon as it is creative, is to make it perceptible, to make visible relationships of time which cannot be seen in the represented object and do not allow themselves to be reduced to the present. That pressure is toward a not yet seen, toward a future memory. So one coda. Weems's recent exhibition, 3 Decades of Photography and Video at the Guggenheim Museum, the museum itself a monument to modern architecture, modern art, but also an institution that has shaped modern art and architectural historiography, was the first solo exhibition by an African-American woman. So in a way, I mean, she's pressuring and she's changing this sort of temporal flow within the monumental institution. Thank you.
I hope you're enjoying yourselves. I'm going to introduce the second speaker of the night, Mark Rakatansky. Mark Rakatansky is a writer and principal of Mark Rakatansky Studio. His designs and writings have appeared in any assemblage, camera work, Journal of Philosophy and the Visual Arts, and the Harvard Architecture Review, among other outlets. His work was included in the Gwangju Design Biennial in South Korea in 2009, the Venice Biennial in 2001, and has been exhibited at the Yale School of Architecture Gallery, New Haven in 2002, the Urban Center, New York 2001, and the School of the Arts and Architecture, University of California at Los Angeles, 1998. He teaches at Columbia University, University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, as well as Mabel, and also Parsons, the New School for Design, and Pratt Institute. He's the author of Tectonic Acts of Desire and Doubt. I'm holding here, again, absolutely wonderful book. And his current book project, titled Unknown for the moment, explores performative modes in Italian architecture during the 16th, 18th, and 20th centuries. Welcome, Mark Rakatansky, to Dia's discussions.
Thank you, Manuel, for the introduction now and the prior one. It's been a fantastic series of discussions that you and I have had since we started this. And thanks to Mabel, too, who mentioned that we've had discussions now for years, decades. And that's why when we had the book launch for Tectonic Acts and Desire and Doubt, Mabel was the first person that I marked as the interlocutor for the evening. And when Manuel said, who should we get as a second today, I was the first person that I said. So thank you, Mabel, for those years. My thanks to Manuel and Yasmiel. Let me just get this clock going here. For continuing and transforming the life of this monumental series of discussions of contemporary culture. Monumental in the sense that T.J. Clark posits in his 2009 Mellon Lectures, currently published as Picasso and Truth, From Cubism to Guernica. Quote, monumental in Picasso does not mean permanent and overweening, it means substantial in Wittgenstein's Tractatus sense. And he refers to a drawing like this, which is about this big, as a way in which a certain kind of enframing can create a kind of monumentality. In other words, you can have a very modest, seemingly modest object like one of these and have quite a monumental series. Clark charts through this book how the domestic scene of a mid-level class portrayed by Picasso evolved and rescaled through modes of the monstrous and the monumental to the monumentalizing environmental expansion of the mural. The motivation to monumentalize in art and architecture, to aggrandize as a form of social redistribution, often manifests in its own time or later as poignantly tragicomic, more often than not unconsciously. But there are artists like Picasso and artists like the ones I will discuss today who consciously put into play these matters, particularly in moments of epistemological transition in which the process of monumentalization is developed and enacted as a form of question, a form of questioning. One architectural genealogy I would like to begin to track here involves certain moments wherein the monumental is drawn into the domestic realm, which calls into question and problematizes both categories, inasmuch as that problem is enacted in the very tectonic and pictorial field and form of the work. My principal point today will be that attempts to monumentalize the domestic tends to result in a domestication of the monumental in art as well as architecture. One could track these problems to the history of social housing, but is equally productive to track the performance of certain acute ambiguities and ironies in the history of certain urban residential palaces from the 16th century, Giulio Romano's Palazzo Stati Macarani of 1524, known to maybe some of you as being the site of the best coffee in Rome here, San Eustachio Il Caffè right there. And Andrea Palladio's Palazzo of Amarana of 1565. And from the 20th century, Luigi Moretti's 1950 Palazzina Casa Il Girsole. And closer to us in time and place, from this century and a few blocks east, Ram Koolhaas's OMA's 2008 project for an apartment complex at 23rd East 22nd Street. This is a transformative genealogy, not only in the evolution of a building type, but of edifices that explicitly enact epistemological transformations in the building itself. In every case, there is a remixing of memory, both domestic and monumental, that results in a problem of identity. There are any number of entry points in this genealogy of a relational classification of scale and the relational scaling of class, from the public-private mixed-use ground level retail and the multi-story upper residential levels in the urban fabric of Roman antiquity to the privatized fortress-like palaces of 15th century Florence. For Giulio Romano, a principal member of Raphael's workshop, the immediate instigating precedent was Bramante's Palazzo Caprini, built in Rome in 1501, which established a paradigm shift in the design of mixed-use buildings, not only for architects practicing in the 16th century, but through to our contemporary culture. Giulio Romano knew this building quite well, as Raphael owned and lived in this building from 1517 to his premature death in 1520. Indeed, the building was known for many years as the House of Raphael. When Bramante revolutionized Roman palazzo design with Palazzo Caprini, he did so by demarcating and thus making apparent two distinct program types that had remained relatively undifferentiated in the tectonics of the building face. Not just the fact that there were retail shops on the ground level, such as, I don't know if I've mentioned this, the best coffee in Rome, Cafe San Eustachio, and residences on the upper level, common since the urban formation of ancient Rome, but the class differences therein, now drawn out by Bramante to the tectonic facade of the building. So you have the shop fronts down here, and you have the piano rustico, the rustic shop fronts, and the piano nobile, the noble orders, up at the top. This contrasting mix of rough retail piano rustico and the refined residential piano nobile is distinctly different from the overall cladding modes of the palaces of Florence and Rome in the previous century, which maintained a more uniformly similar material character through all of the floor levels. Bramante's radical remix of the mixed-use palazzo type was to make visibly architectural this class division in the social field between retail and residential, between public and private, inverting, in fact, the signification of rustication in early Florentine palazzos as representing a fortification of the higher class to now representing the lower, literally the base material from which the nobles rise above, or rather rise off from, signified through the monumentalizing application of the classical orders. Ironically, Bramante's strict tectonic division between classes developed precisely in a moment when the lines of these divisions in the social field were beginning to blur from below as the success of Italian merchants Throughout the world, markets provided the means to reconstruct their social identity through the construction of private residences. And from above, as the administrative and professional classes associated with the church were allowed, by a papal bull of Leo X, to extend the ability to build beyond that of the clergy. This double irony is that it was Bramante himself who facilitated this aspiration for the piano nobile by those not themselves in the noble class, yet aspiring to present the appearance of nobility, which Bramante enacted in the very material of the palazzo itself, through the invention of inexpensive technique of stucco-covered brickwork, both for the upper-level orders and the rusticated lower level, aspiring to look like expensive stonework, aspiring to imitate the load-bearing stone of antiquity, which, as historian Christoph Frommel states, quote, reduced the cost of construction considerably and made the possibility of a direct imitation of the ancients very inviting for patrons of reduced financial means. Without this economical technique, Bramante's direct successor, not just Raphael, Peruzzi, Giulio Romano, but also Sansovino, San Michele, and Palladio, would never have been able to achieve some of their most important works. In other words, in contemporary words, it's fake playing, fake it till you make it, frontin', putting on a fictive front. The history of architecture, so often seen as the history of the upper and ruling classes, might need some reworking as a history of the aspirational classes, aspiring to rule social representation using architecture as an instrument of aspiration for others as well as for themselves. This is as true for the always politicized creation of public housing as it is for private palaces in whichever century and whichever country. In the case of Giulio Romano's Palazzi Stati Macarani, located in such a financially significant area of Rome, proximate to the Custom House, the university, and Medici family residences, it is significant in this regard that even a patrician patron like Christoph Stati, albeit not a particularly wealthy one, could not, it seems, afford a totally private palazzo. In other words, while aspiring to upgrade his own family property to something more monumental, Stati could not afford not to gather income from ground-level shops, as seen here in Vossi's later 18th century view, one of the many coincidences of Mabel's and mine presentation over here. There will be many more. Well within the canonical development of imitative models of antiquity in the early Cinquecento, with Palazzo Stati Macarani, the young 20-something Giulio Romano will in turn remix this mixed-use building type and rearrange Bramante's categorization and ordering of these designated architectural figures. Beginning in Rome and later in Mantua, Giulio will simultaneously accentuate and put into transformative play these hierarchical class systems within their social and tectonic fields of signification. The sharp distinction in Palazzo Caprini of the depth and deployment between the piano rustico and piano nobile are blended back together into relief by Giulio, developing a mutable field that begins to draw relations between the piano rustico and all the categories of the upper level as never before, not in spite of, but because of the seemingly insubstantial materiality that allowed such mutability. If Bramante's atectonic transformation in what is generally considered the High Renaissance seems shockingly insubstantial, it is this play between the substantiality and insubstantiality that is precisely what is at stake among the most significant artists of this time and what follows. Closer to our time, T.J. Clark states, quote, Picasso, we know, worked like a beaver at making the architecture substantial and insubstantial at the same time, close quote. And states further that Wittgenstein equally worked from both ends of the spectrum towards its seeming opposite, as did Giulio Romano in their frescoes as well as in their architecture. And here we have once again, as Mabel suggested, the presence of Egypt in Rome, the crush that they had, and both the way in which they wanted to crush and overpower the empires of others. And you can see over here the way in which you have this massive structural element, substantial element resting against a trompe-l'oeil depiction of a caryatid. For Picasso, as well as for Raphael and Giulio, exploring this combination of monumentality and domesticity, of grand themes in everyday life, or to use Clarke's terms, how the isolated aloneness of monumentality could become accompaniment, familiar idealization, sewn into the texture of everyday life. The performative modes of the iterative figural fields found in certain monuments of antiquity provided crucial reference points. As Clarke notes, for Picasso, in portraying the transformation of domestic figures into a more monumental but still domestic battlefield of Guernica, the, quote, world of the sarcophagi is near, close quote. Near being, in this case, roughly 1,800 years near. For Raphael and Giulio, who learned from the sarcophagi a similar lesson of how iterative figurations in field rescale monumentality, you can shave off 400 years or so, so roughly 1,400 years near. For Picasso, it is a laboratory of cubism that in an analytic and synthetic manner allowed him to perceive and enact figuration emerging from and disappearing into a field. For Giulio, it is a laboratory of what is now known as a Raphael stanza, the rooms of the papal residency. I'll just quickly go over the slide over here. Here you have Palazzo Caprini from Bramante. Here you have two palazzos from Raphael's workshop that Giulio worked on. You can see the strict division of class and classification of elements over here, from the rustic base to the piano nobile. Giulio Romano in Palazzo Stati Marcarani will start to blend them together. Sorry. For Giulio is a laboratory of what is now known as the Raphael stanza, the rooms of the papal residence in the Vatican. We saw an example before. Monumental and administrative as these rooms may have been, they are still the domestic habitation of the Pope, which fostered this perception and practice. In the stanza, Raphael and Giulio's frescoes developed animated flows of movement, dynamically interactive exchanges, spatialized accumulations and dispersals of various figures into and out from a series of centers and edges. These vertical experiments became even more dynamic as they led up to the work that Giulio completed in the stanza after Raphael's death during design of the Palazzo Stati Marcarani. The techniques Giulio engaged in pictorially in the frescoes in the Vatican will begin to emerge in his architecture at this time and evolve with full force in the later work once he moved to Mantova. The iterative layering, relational exchanges between backgrounds and foregrounds, both horizontally and vertically, establishing and exceeding frameworks, direct form of address to the viewer, the play between real and fictive structures through substantial and insubstantial structural frameworks, and the rescaling and repositioning of hierarchical categories and classes. Throughout these works, Giulio will de-isolate the figure as foregrounded against the background, creating figurations that emerge as woven in and through a field, a pictorial field, a tectonic field, a social field. Giulio Romano's contribution here is threefold: developing performative fields, figures enacting iterative transformations rather than repetitions, hybrid figurations, these transformations will often result in new hybrid formations, and metafield, the very field itself is exposed in a contextual self-consciousness. Unlike most other palazzo designs at the time, that merely repeat across their facades a standard bay unit, even at this early moment in his career, Giulio is developing, through superimposed layers and interpenetrating forces, dynamically iterative orderings of the figures within the pictorial field he's creating. At Palazzo Stati-Macarani, the tectonic fields of rustication, windows and pilasters and framing elements will not just be ordered in one fixed manner, but will rearrange on each side of the building. And here's an animation of that. So here's the north storefront as it goes around to the east side over here. Giulio starts to compress certain of the elements. The windows shrink. This impost cornice expands, and these stones called the voussoirs catch up. On the west side, he'll strip it back to the original medieval fabric that he's building off of, another compression of those stones. The mezzanine window will shrink. The interstitial space will now expand, changing the number and shape of these stones down here. Another crucial invention of Giulio is a surprising abstraction of the orders in the Attic story, which is neither the expected step up the evolutionary ladder to Ionic or Corinthian orders, nor merely autonomous frame elements unrelated to the other levels as in many other palazzos. Given that the attic level housed the servants, what is enacted here in this transformation from piano nobile to the attic is certainly in some sense a systematic denobilization, a reevaluation and enactment of the actual social order. So if we clone the piano nobile and go up toward the attic, the articulation of the orders will start to disappear, kind of Cheshire cat kind of way. And then the pedestals will start to disappear. And the window will transform. In today's language, this would be called a certain form of parametrics. In other words, the metrics, certain metrics, the parameters of which can be adjusted. In Giulio Romano's case, these have a social meaning. Not just a purely formal meaning. Given that in this moment of the Cinquecento, there was such desire to appropriate the monumentality of antiquity in order, in part, to establish a national identity against what Raphael and Castiglione, in their famous letter to Leo X, called the perfidious enemies of the Latin name, the Goth and the Vandals of the North, where did this seemingly antithetical view emanate? Where did this seemingly antithetical mode of animate play emanate from? From antiquity as well, it turns out, indeed from a number of domestic modes in the pictorial and performative fields, as indeed Raphael and Giulio tried to make sense of the more playful aspects in the pictorial and performative arts of antiquity. The first instance with what the somber functionary Vitruvius in his architectural treatise called the decadent style of wall painting that in the Cinquecento became to be known as the Grottesca, and became all the rage, rediscovered around 1480 in the then buried grotto-like rooms of Nero's Golden House that you see here. Giulio's friend Cellini in his autobiography states that the proper name for these improper figures is monsters, in keeping with the sense that T.J. Clark posits the term as both being out of joint and being out of normative culture. It is precisely its insubstantiality, its non-monumental domestic lightheartedness and light-handedness, as well as its hybrid monstrousness, that Vitruvius rallies against in the treatise. So it is particularly intriguing that Raphael in a circle should not only approve of, but emulate its style, first in Cardinal Bibbiano's bathing loggia in his apartment in the Vatican, and the extensive loggia of the papal apartments that has come to be known as the Raphael loggia, and in the loggia of Cupid and Psyche in the Villa Farnesina. These animated hybrid modes are thus in keeping with two other crucial playful models of this other antiquity that has become a focus in this time, the monumentally mythological metamorphosis of Ovid and the more domestic metamorphosis of Apuleius, which Julia depicted as mentioned in Villa Farsina that you see here, as well as at Palazzo Te. Oh, no, sorry, those are a little bit out of order. Here is the Raphael rooms here. Here we have Raphael looking at us looking. And here are the field conditions that Giulio develops in the Hall of Constantine over here. And I'll just go back and mention the rescaling and repositioning of hierarchical categories and classes, as in this example of the plucky comic relief of the immoderately attired dwarf soldier in relation to the more moderately attired dwarf soldier in relation to the more monumental moderato across the trompe-l'oeil break in the pictorial field of the battlefield through her gesture, right hand extended into his field, giving the appearance of almost touching him, and his gaze, which gives the appearance of leering at her. At Palazzo Te, there is a hybrid world wherein unions of goats and nymphs create satyrs. There's the goats, there's the nymphs, as close as you can get to the humanoids in the demigod world, and there's the hybrid result, the satyrs. The gomen or the huotes. And once again, there's a play between the insubstantial frescoed rustication. So here's the Hall of Psyche over here, and what I'm going to point to is this painted rustication over here, these massive brackets over here, and these vegetative structure over here. And once again, there is a play between the insubstantial frescoed rustication and vegetative structure supporting the seemingly substantially real and massive brackets and ceiling structure, which actually is suspended from chains connected to hidden beams. On the west wall of this room, we have frescoed large the problem of scaling monumental desire in relation to a domestic scene. Each time these unrequited loves will break the scene's framework. It may have worked out if the Cyclops had scaled his desire to the nymph that he was in love with, but in fact, he is too enormous to be contained in the frame. Persephone will be cursed with the desire to mate with a bull, the union of which will create the Minotaur, a hybrid figure. Anyway, here's the Persephone, and that's the way it should be, but the force of the desire causes the tail to exceed the frame. The union which will create the Minotaur, a hybrid figure that Picasso depicts in numerous incarnations, sometimes monstrously, overwhelmingly, monumentally wild, sometimes domesticated. The monumental force of Jupiter's desire will be so enormous, which, as Canguilhem states, is a matter of exceeding norms, so as to move Olympia's hand out of the frame. This mixture of the superscale brought into the domestic scene occurs throughout Palazzo Te. In the Hall of the Horses, for example, where the patron's favorite horse is, this one is called Dario, which should be grazing outside of the wall, is brought in and over the fictive orders and window and looks at us looking at him still with wild surprise. In the Hall of the Giants, in what could be claimed as the first fully immersive environmental installation, the hubris of monumental drive results in the depicted collapse. The third inspiration from antiquity was the domestic comedies of Plautus and Terence, as unlike the supremacy of the monumental tragic genre in ancient Greek drama. In terms of what ancient Roman drama survived into the 16th century, comedy was king, with the only primary surviving example of tragedy being the non-dramatized reading plays of Seneca. The comic mode is a way to inhabit but still question certain forms of monumental authority, which can account for why the second of 4 sections of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier is focused on Cardinal Bibbiano's extensive discussion of the performative techniques of wit, including techniques of scale, overstatement, and understatement, hybrid mixtures of genres, grave and amusing. Comedy is always a performance of potentially minor domestic tragedies for the characters with mix-ups and fix-ups, and the comic mutability of the mixed or hybrid composite figures is a form of performance common to the very plays Giulio was designing stages for, or with whose authors, the major writers of the day, he had close affiliation. The mixing of identities of masters and servant in Ariosto's The Pretender, for which Raphael and Giulio composed this stage design for its performance before Leo X in 1515. The mixture of genders between male and female twins in Bibbiano's Calandra, for which Giulio composed the stage design in Mantova in 1532, or the mixing of both class and gender, as in the play Giulio is briefly cited by name, Arantino's The Stable Master, in which the page Carlo has the role of the, quote, bride to the main character. In these performances of transformation from one characterization to another, characters emerge and recede, concealed literally in trunks or figuratively in other identities, disappear and reemerge. The pleasure for the audience is in the witnessing of the shifts of transformation, all the while being conscious of the double identity and double agency of these figures within the social field of the story. And a similar pleasure may be had in witnessing the transformation of the class of orderings in the work of Giulio Romano. In many comedies of antiquity and the Renaissance comedies mentioned here, it is the clever servant, the lower class, that arranges all the crucial exchanges and interactions for their masters, both libidinal and social, an enactment of the crucial presence and role of seemingly non-monumental characters. Indeed, in Plautus's comedy, The Braggart Soldier, it is the protagonist slave who is called the architect. As is made so evident in Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, these writers, artists, architects, and courtiers of this time, however successful they may have been, still are creatures in some hybrid middle level of class, themselves servant to the noble ruling class. So this repeated literary, pictorial, and architectural engagement with the epistemological questions of identity and the classification of these social figures may not be too surprising. It is during this time in France that the word domestic refers to the staff of referring to the staff of a household will originate, coming from Latin domus, referring to the upper class residencies of antiquity. While this term will not be adopted in Italian until the 19th century, there are many debates through many centuries as to whether administrative members of domestic staff, tutors, secretaries, bookkeepers, courtiers, should be lumped into the same class and classification as servants, and as to whether they belong to the house or belong to the owners. As in the transformation of orders from Piano Nobile to the attic on the exterior facades of Palazzo Stacchi Macarani, Giulio will paint glimpses up into the life of the servant level in the coffered ceiling of the Room of Victory in Palazzo Te, and in the painted mezzanine window panel of the northern facade of the courtyard. There's a servant putting some flowers out. And he will enact spatial inversions of servants and voyeurs configured over noble figures in many of his paintings and etchings. In the Fugger altarpiece, Two Lovers, which you see here, the portrait of Isabella d'Este, and in the infamous illustrations for the Il Modi. A similar startling shift in social and tectonic classification occurs in this ground level portal of the palazzo, which is an elaborately enhanced and composite figure placed by Giulio in the center of the arrangement, developed from a mixture of low piano rustico. Here's the fake plain stucco-covered bricks. This is real stone, but takes on the coursing of those bricks. But it has the high-order pediment and capitals and basses. A composite figure placed by Giulio in the center of the arrangement, developed as a mixture of low piano rustico and high piano nobile figuration of the pediment and the applied orders. Yet like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland or the apparating and disapparating figures in Harry Potter, seems to be in the midst of appearance and disappearance, emergence and de-emergence. Critics have tended to use nearly sexualized term in describing the relationship between these stones called the voussoirs and the pediment and the portal. The voussoirs is said either to brutally invade to Fourie or to be held fast by Wolfgang Lutz, the pediment, perhaps in an unstated and unconscious reference to Giulio's etchings of the Ilmodi series of the same period. But what are those Kama Sutra-like positions of these etchings, other than the parametrics of bodily components, move his arm here, move her leg there, through various forms of a mutual and interactive arrangement and rearrangement. Comparing Ilmodi's most well-known example, position 11 over on the right, in which the mattress and the couple are simultaneously slipped off partway down off the bed and lifted up, with position 8, in which the mattress is still on the bed, as is the couple, positioned in a similar pose but with their opposite limbs engaged. We can perceive through their actions a dynamic transitioning and repositioning, just as we saw on the facade development, a succession of dynamic actions reconfigured here with the latter as the before and the former as the after. So if we move the mattress back up on the bed, we start to bring it down over here. She has to hang on to the pillow as it goes down. The legs change, and the arm changes, and then we have the servant looking in on the episode. And that looks a little something in animation like that. Beretavacchia, the expert in this on the Ilmodi, has stated that what is most scandalous about this series in its time was neither the visually explicit sex nor Arantino's accompanying smutty sonnets, but the enactment of the mutual engagement in the exchange rather than a portrayal of a singular, forceful male action. Historians had an uncomfortable time relating the Ilmodi to Giulio's architectural production. Giulio, I should have stated, did these illustrations over here, which is part of the reason he had to get out of Rome quickly when he went up to Mantova. The printer was imprisoned, but he escaped because of his connections. Historians have had an uncomfortable time relating Ilmodi to Giulio's architectural production, judging from the almost complete silence in this regard, but at a most fundamental level, in the dynamic order and parametric mutability within and between the varying positions in which these exchanges are enacted, there are a few aspects of this dynamic performances that can be noted. First, what Giulio enacts throughout his work is the interrelation of figures within a field. The voussoirs and the pediment and the central portal of Palazzi State Macarani are engaged in a mutual interaction rather than one figure acting upon another. Just as in Giulio's most infamous scene in the courtyard of Palazzo Te, to discuss the slipped triglyph as a single figure is to miss a crucial point. What one encounters there is the triglyph slipping down while the pediment underneath it opens up. Right there. An interactive repositioning, like the couple slipping down and lifting up in the Omodi etching, a double movement along a vertical axis. Not a single figure, but a coupled figure, like the beast, to use Rabelais' phrase, with two backs. This is the second aspect to note with respect to the couples in and of the Omodi. In Giulio's work, this coupling can manifest as a composite or hybrid figures, as we saw in the doorway. This very desire and unease in the Cinquecento regarding how to arrange a composite identity of the modern and antiquity, Arantino turns into the highest compliment for his friend Giulio, just as Serlio will praise him for his ability to mix low and high styles. In the examples from Omodi shown here, Giulio's further develops iterative sequencing and voyeuristic self-consciousness resonates with certain issues circulating during the second discussion symposium, Vision and Visuality, held 26 years ago across the street at 548 22nd, in which Rosalind Krauss, with reference to Jonathan Criery's archaeology of optical devices, such as a zoetrope, which produced, quote, the double effect of both having the experience and watching oneself having it from the outside, constructing the gestalt and undoing at the same time, both positioning us within the scene as an active viewer and outside of it as a passive witness. This double mode is already evident in Raphael, this is Raphael's painting of him and Giulio, Raphael's double portrait, in which Raphael looks out at us, and Giulio is shown animated in the midst of turning back from Raphael while he points out to us looking. In regard to the last period of Picasso's production, focused on reanimating Delacroix, Velasquez, Ingres, and Monet, Krauss posits not a single vision, not even merely some general series of variations, but rather a sequential mode of productions of animated drawings. One aspect that links the four paintings that Picasso selected of these artists, an aspect that Picasso engaged, is that versions of the painting Picasso reworked all share forms of direct address to the viewer by some of the portrayed characters, indeed often by characters that should be secondary, such as the models and servants and artists and others of the court. In the case of Ingres' version of Raphael and the Fornacina, Ingres domesticates the monumental Raphael within a demurely domestic lovey-dovey scene with his model, condensing and remixing several artifacts from Raphael's work, the Pope's chair that you see here, this is Leo X, Transfiguration, and depending on who is reading the work, Raphael's competitor, Michelangelo, or his assistant, Giulio Romano, according to Leo Steinberg, which still does not distract Raphael from the gaze towards his work, even as his love interest catches our interest by seeming to gaze out at us three ways in the first version, two of which being the portraits of her by Raphael, that Raphael has already painted or is in the midst of painting as we gaze at this scene. And in Vasari's portrait of Raphael as a life of the artist, this story of this model over here is supposed to be Raphael's undoing here, because as he was working on Villa Farcina, he couldn't pay attention to his work unless he had his lover there, and so the patron smuggles her into the building so he can carry on the work. All the more scandalous as the woman in question was not seemingly of the proper class, but as Ingres' title titles her, a baker's daughter. Picasso, in his recombination of Ingres in the Suite 347 series that Krauss refers to, developed in his 87th year, seems in the initial etching to posit Raphael post-coitally, post-lovey with his dovey, and then winds back the clock through ever more entangled fields of interaction with each of the 27 etchings, turning this domestic scene into an overall overflowing, monstrous, even monumental disjunctive sequencing. The portrait on the easel in many of the etchings, let's see if we go back, in many of the etchings looks out at us still, even as lovers in most of the series are locked eye to eye, organ to organ, as their bodies torque in ever more extreme sports contrapposto, making even the most strenuous il modi positions look somewhat tame. By now, the other viewers have been moved by Picasso into the foreground, the Pope back in his chair alongside the couple, and Michelangelo peering from under the bed at us peering. And in a further replay of Hongrie, Picasso will bring to the scene his own young printing assistant, Pierre, over there. This references in concert with Krauss's observation in this period of Picasso's work that it is through this iterative mode of production in his sketchbooks and etchings that he will develop the modality of an animated flipbook, citing Picasso's statement at the time that, quote, "The movement of painting, the dramatic push from one vision to the next, I have arrived at the moment where the movement of my thought interests me more than my thought itself." This mode parallels Frummel's noting that, quote, "Raphael, much more than Michelangelo, introduced the concept of movement into architecture, substituting the static condition with a succession of dynamic actions." Recombinant Raphael from Hongrie to Picasso via Giulio Romano, in the time remaining I would like to quickly trace the recombinant genealogy that the monumental domesticity of the Palazzo type undergoes from Giulio Romano to Palladio to Moretti to Koolhaas. Soon we know how static this type, well, any type really, will become through the centuries, so that the initial questioning switches to more or less the same answer over and over again. And Palladio's first major urban palace, Palazzo Porto of 1552, was indeed a rather static rehash of Bramante's model of a rustic base, and second level and noble with classic orders. 13 years later, Palladio will, which indeed has all the hybrid features we have come to associate with late work, will introduce for the first time a monumental two-story order into the palazzo type of Palazzo Valmarana of 1565. The result, as in late Picasso, of the influence of media of its representation and the production and reproduction of that media, in particular as Palladio engaged with the burgeoning Venetian publishing industry to become the first architect ever to put his own designs into print with the publication of a treatise, The Four Books of Architecture. And so even though Michelangelo at that time had started to do a monumental order, Palladio is the first one to put it into a private palace. In the section of his treatise entitled On Abuses, Palladio rails against any fabrication of any building element that diminishes its primary purpose, which according to him is to, quote, appear to produce the effect for which they were put there, which is to make the structure look secure and stable, or as Clark talked about, substantial. The equivocal choice is telling: appear, affect, make the structure look, but appearance, affect, fabricated structure are the main modalities of the Cinquecento, which was a matter and manner of representation rather than reality. And in fact, by introducing a play between the monumental and the now standard palazzo order, Palladio abuses a standard form of security and stability in a number of radical ways. First, by pushing the giant composite order into the building fabric so much that it cuts into and through the lower implied entablature. So this is supposed to be a beam called an entablature, like these things coming along this way, and he just pushes it so far in that it actually cuts that, destroying all semblance of what's supposed to be the structural flow of forces. Brutally destroying any sense of the horizontal distribution of loads at that level. And second, here's an example of what that should look like over here. You should see it should be a continuous horizontal beam, but what he does is cut right through it. And second, there's the really shocking there's a really shocking, oh no, he didn't moment, the removal of the giant order from the ends of the facade at exactly the points that classically would demand the most support, security, and stability, the most substantiality, so that now the edges of the building are left to lone caryatids perched on a single-story secondary pilaster, domestics holding up the monumental visual load, now weakened even more than Giulio Romano's slipped triglyph. Thus, a conservative critic, Malizia, will note in 1781, quote, "Everyone can see that the intersection of the cornice by the colossal pilasters is not in a pure taste. The worst is that the corners, there are only Corinthian pilasters up onto the first story, on the second, only a soldier with his back to the wall." In the case of Palazzo Valmarana, Palladio transfers and transforms Vermonte's Palazzo Caprini model from the social fabric of Rome to that of Vicenza by expanding the orders across levels, representing with some nervous leftover rustication traces down here, that actually in Vicenza, nobles occupied both the ground level and the piano nobile. And Palladio will posit that as putting a monumental temple front onto the domestic residence, as he did here and at the Villa Rotonda, is justified, as he claims, without actually any archaeological evidence, that the temple form, the monumental form, emerged from the domestic house form. All these tectonic elements, columns, entablatures, rustication, which even in Bramante Palazzo were fake depth, Palladio developed now as a multiple superimposed layer collapsed onto a radical surface relief that still maintains a legibility and interaction of the separate layers. This is a kind of meta media move. And back to the famous letter that Raphael and Castiglione wrote to Leo X, they say to document the remains of antiquity, you should really use orthogonal projection. You should not use perspective because perspective lies. This is funny that an expert master perspectivist like Raphael will turn his back from his own painterly mode and say, no, you have to use an orthogonal, orthographic projection, straight elevations and plans in order to tell the truth. The funny thing that happens is that when you use the truth here, you develop certain falsehoods, so that the layers that would happen when Palladio is trying to reconfigure antiquity over here will collapse onto a single surface. So the plays of depth now get in Palazzo Valmarana, suddenly that play of depth suddenly now collapses into the trouble that the monumental will give to the domestic. And this is one of many conditions where here again he's trying to reconstruct this ancient temple of Nerva Trajan. And so that you see this is a loggia that's behind the columns of the porch over here, and you see them, you see that the horizontal structure over here is cut through by the columns. Of course, it's not cut through, it's just that this is behind, and if you looked at it this way, it would all be fine, but there's a radical collapse, a radical falsehood that the truth of orthogonal projection will encounter. And here is Palazzo Valmarana, and you can see that in a way he is now doing the same things. Here are the columns cut through there. You have figures at the level of the top of the capitals. You have this base condition suddenly collapsed onto the front face of the building. This is a way in which, just as Krauss talks about with Picasso, in which the media now becomes definitely the message, and the media production that Palladio is encountering in the start, really, of the book industry in Venice will start to influence his architecture. The same thing when he first publishes illustrations for a translation of Vitruvius that his client Barbaro puts together, where here's where he imagines that the house, the Roman house, has a temple front. Again, there's no archaeological evidence of that. He just wanted to do it in his own work. But you have the effect of what in printing is called the showing through. In other words, the condition of the paper will affect the visibility. Anyone who works with trace paper has seen this, and Palladio now will take advantage of that and begin to use certain elements and have this hybrid configuration of what's showing through starting to emerge onto the surface. This also happens in his own treatise when he's working on the 4 books. Here's the first palazzo I talked about, rather conventional Roman piano rustico, piano nobile. Over here, here's Palazzo Valmarana, and the inner courtyard, which Palladio proposed would have a giant order. It was never built. If now you see the way it is in the book over here, it's behind that page, and you can start to see how certain elements will now be brought in. You can start to read them like trace paper through, and they will become the Palazzo Valmarana. So various ways in which the media, surprising for someone like Palladio that seems quite pure, but in the later work becomes quite mannered. And it's an interesting, intriguing fact that Palladio had in his possession around this time Parmigiano's self-portrait in a convex mirror. And you see in Palazzo Valmarana that they inscribing the very act of his inscription, representing the act of representation, where different kinds of self-consciousness is fostered through this metamedia. Jumping into the 20th century, another form of self-portrait in an exaggerated and distorted mirror, another form of hybrid accumulation and iterative memories of monumentality and domestic form can be cited in Luigi Moretti's Palazzina, Casa Il Giasole of 1950. In this country, he is somewhat better known as the architect of the Watergate complex. We seem to have come a long way from Giulio's Palazzo to the mid-century, 20th century Palazzina, because as no longer can the aspirational class afford their own palazzo or even their own floor, as was in the case of Raphael's Palazzo Alberini, but now sheer floor. And this breaking down of the monumental palazzo even cleaves a gap in the front facade as a way to maintain privacy between the units, which is treated by Moretti as a way to remonumentalize a facade as evoking the form of a classic split pediment. But in fact, it's not too far to get from one to the other. You can see both have a piano rustico over here. This actually has commercial, retail, commercial activities down the base, as well as the people who do the maintenance for the building. They actually, to scale, are roughly around the same height, but we have to break into 4 floors now, Giulio. We lift up the attic over here, which you remember used to be for the servants, but now with the event of the elevator now becomes the more privileged penthouse. And we can cut through there, and that pediment then becomes that roof. But just as the building seems to come into a substantial monumental unity, Moretti keeps breaking the elements down into insubstantial planes that exceed frameworks and fragments of recursive memory that resist easy resolutions. Moretti is, as is the case with all of the artists and architects I mentioned today, a complex character historically, and this complexity is enacted in the very material mode of the building. Moretti has been accused of making fake rustication here, but what makes Moretti's rustication fake? Given that it is real stone developed parametrically along a diverse range of material and cultural parameters of its identity, as picturesque landscape elements, rusticated blocks, fluted surface, modernist thin cladding, classic statuary. A transformative performance not only of the historical biography of stone and architecture, and by the way, here we have another disturbing caryatid, as in Palladio's Palazzo Valmarana, but also of Moretti's own autobiography as an architect. The building is an extraordinary montage of manic and melancholy mourning of Moretti's work for the Mussolini, his early Beaux-Arts work, or eclectic work, and his neo-rationalist modernist work. The building is an extraordinary montage of manic and melancholy mourning, whose patron Moretti met when they shared a jail cell following the war. It is an iterative, recursive representation of the failures and fragments of attempt to establish a monumental national identity played out here on a domestic scale in this palazzina, this little palazzo. We would seem even further from Giulio Romano with this case of Koolhaas's New York Tower, hardly to be considered a townhouse-style New York palazzo. Perhaps for me, one of the most revealing moments last week when I was in Venice for the opening of the Biennale, directed this year by Koolhaas, was this installation at the Arsenale, a collaborative homage to the Renaissance by Koolhaas and his photographer daughter, Charlie. Given that the topic of Biennale related to questions of modernity, it seems that Koolhaas, let me mention what this is first over here, which is this is the Laurentian Library, and what Koolhaas says is, in the fall of 2006, I felt a sudden urge to revisit or visit for the first time the Italian Renaissance. I won't read it all. So in 2006, I went to Italy again in an ultimate effort to understand. By far the most disturbing space I experienced in this journey was the vestibule of the Laurentian Library by Michelangelo. And so this is a whole text about how strange and significant the Renaissance is. Given that the topic of the Biennale related to questions of modernity, Koolhaas here, like De Forest, seems to be suggesting that the very need to look back at the Renaissance, to look forward. The question here is, and once again, there's a mix of domestic and monumentality. Michelangelo, breaks down and reimagines the wall, the window, and the door in an area no bigger than a living room, dominated by a huge sculpture that pretends to be a staircase. Is this a retroactive manifesto? Is this a belated love letter? A shout out to his homie? A recommendation tweet? As I say, it seems that Koolhaas is asking us to look back to the Renaissance in order to look forward, as in fact Giulio did. Again, there's a little bit of scale difference between Giulio Romano here and this project, but in fact, it really starts this project as a New York townhouse palazzo type. Here it is to scale over here. Again, you have a ground floor public area over here. It's a screening room for the talent agency, the creative arts agency, CAA. It's actually quite a narrow site. It's 33 feet, about a third of Palazzo State Macarani. And so if we start to take away some of the layers of Giulio over here, lift that up so that their ground level publicness is about the same height, split that up into 3 floors, you can see that we're getting pretty close over here. And now we just add the rest of the floors, parametrically change them so they start to have the mutability that we saw in Giulio Romano, and then shift them over because they had the air rights. We're not too far away. Here is that screening room, as I said. This pillowed acoustical surface is almost a kind of soft rustication in a certain way. Here's the section through the buildings. Here's the Giulio Romano. You have an inner court here in Moretti, that's a service court now, and the court has started to pile up with, start to emerge to the outside with this staircase over here. Here, this is embedded in the Coolhouse building, so you're somewhere in between these two. There's the courtyard of Palazzo Stati Macarani. Here's the staircase emerging to the open air in Casa Giosole. You can even be Roberto Rossellini, married to Ingrid Bergman at the time, over here living. Here's the staircase. In 1957, and so already you'll have the paparazzi waiting outside over here, as they probably will be were this to have been built. So we're not too far away. And we're not too far away from the kind of hybrid mixing, nor from the fecund scenes of voyeurs looking at certain unions that create strange hybrids. This is a cover of Delirious New York. This is from the OMA office over here. You can see all the mutantness developing into that project. Here's further voyeurism from the book here, published at that time in Delirious New York with Coolhouse's wife's drawings. And now, even though there isn't time to tell the flip side, we've arrived at the flip side of the story, how domestic elements have been brought into monumental artifacts in ways that further problematize both categories. Certainly the very artists and architects I've discussed here could be further discussed in this manner. Indeed, many of the most potent tragedies rescale the monumental within its domestic undoing. Hamlet, Lear, Hecuba, Antigone, Oedipus, shown here by Ingres, questioned by the Sphinx, and here. That Kara Walker, now coming to this summer, that Kara Walker has now literally and figuratively reintroduced the domestic into the monumental. This exaggeration of norms, as Canguilhem says, this enormous bittersweet play of monumental sensuality, hybridizing themes that can be found at play back in Villa Farcina in 1519 of the domestic servant in Sotomayor's scene of the marriage consummation of Alexander the Great and Roxana, and Raphael's Sphinx, right here, scaled down to the domestic pet size to represent Egypt. Again, it's both the crush that Rome has and the way in which it crushes and domesticates Egypt in the monumental console of the gods that oversee Raphael and Giulio's depiction of Apuleius's fecund metamorphic marriage of Cupid and Psyche. Themes and modalities fecund that still, through the centuries, continue to ask us some very fundamental questions, as the Sphinx does, of identity and its transformation. Thank you.
So, for those who remain here, thank you for staying. I know it's a beautiful day outside, very tempting. Thank you both for these two illuminating presentations, really amazing. I think they converge in multiple ways, and my first question will, to both of you will have to do with that convergence. If I if I may try to summarize my feeling about this convergence, on the one hand, and I will start actually with Mark, since chronologically went further back, but you see the domestication of monumentality as sort of force of attraction of the monumental into the domestic regime, and this generating a number of alterations, mutations, hybridizations. And I mean, I saw some sort of incestuous force inside, this sort of like bringing things back to the home, where all this, you know, socially, the social aesthetic principles articulate in the beginning and politically, as they do, and then they're brought and sort of like crushed into this these domestic, concentrated, saturated forms. And so there's this force of attraction, and if I look at Mabel's presentation, then there's this force of subtraction, emergence, and emancipation, how from the domestic, from the space where the slave and the domestic is preserved and encapsulated, there's a force that emerges out of the domestic space and starts appropriating this language that has been interiorized by the domestic space, and then transforming it, and then we can start speaking about ways of transformation and an economy of mutations that maybe could be shared between monumental forms of resistance and monumental forms of dissent or of speculation. So this said, and I don't know how far I'm being accurate or totally astray in my perception, but I would like to ask you both to tell us, how do you see this convergence? How do you interpret the superimposition of some of your, well, if not ideas, at least images and examples and sites? How do you see that superimposition? How can you read one lecture through the other? Maybe Mabel, you can start.
I'll give Mark a quick break. No, I mean, I think they're both very complementary, actually, lectures, which work. I think they work very well together, and I feel like Mark has been at the turntables longer than I have in some respects in terms of his theme. This is, I mean, some of it's based on my own older work, but this work about Carrie Mae Weems and some of the issues that are coming up are quite new. But I think exactly what you're doing were some of the things I was trying to figure out within her own images, particularly the first one I showed, is precisely this exact kind of clash and remix of all of these things that collapse in that space. And she isn't the only one seeing it, but precisely Vasi sees it, Piranesi sees this, but they in their own articulation, you know, sort of do it in very, very different ways. And what I thought was amazing, just comparing Vasi and Piranesi, was the way in which sort of the vertical depth of Piranesi, that it's just dense and it's very fluid, and it's, you know, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, I mean, you get the sense of the kind of layers of the earthbound and that kind of verticality, almost the same thing that you're seeing sort of in Romano, versus the Vasi, which is kind of very horizontal and sort of moving through the city like the narrative of the book. So you don't get the same kind of earthiness of the way in which the engraving and representation works. So it was amazing to kind of see how even those engravers are kind of working with, you know, the actual site itself, then its representation in the engraving and what they're able to interpret. And that's what I was interested in Weems, is the way in which her photographs are also playing with the history of the site, the architecture itself, but also the way in which it's playing with art history and the history of the photograph capturing a moment of a historical moment of a moment. So there's a kind of constant double play echoing, I think, in her work. And I think that Mark's sort of analysis of those buildings and the way in which there are these slippages and layerings, I feel like is exactly what she's doing in those photographs in some respects, in terms of how she's playing with the question of the monument and the history of the city. And I think Rome is precisely that kind of material that allows us to do that because of its own sort of legacy in bodies of knowledge as well. But I also think this question of the domestic and the public are also interesting. What was compelling for me, and which I think is something I want to develop more in this work, is to try to understand because, you know, the kitchen series that Weems does it's precisely the table that becomes the site of performance, just like she's saying it's the piazza, it's the, but it's a domestic space, right, in which social roles and performances play themselves out. And that was always the kind of preserve, particularly of African American women, and that's again why I think that piece was so profound when it was done. But then here she is, her figure now in this kind of very, grand, monumental public realm, and in what ways is she playing within that space? Is she indeed alienated, which I don't get the sense of within those images? And especially if you read the images as a kind of a series, right, a kind of cadence as she moves through the city, there's a much more kind of radical play, I think, that's going on with where she goes and what she looks at when she's in the interior, when she's in, there's, which I didn't show, there was an image of her in the movie studio, which I believe. And, the idea...
There's an image, someone from our team showed me an image from Dia Beacon.
Yeah.
It was at Dia Beacon.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like...
Yeah, no, and so she's playing with this idea of the staging and the kind of performativity of the public. I mean, the public is a kind of scaffold that allows for the performance of civic and public life. But, how does one enter into that, and what is that play? And, and what is that position of power, which I think Mark articulates very well, right? That there are social hierarchies that represent themselves on these edifices, on these facades.
Well, in particular about Carrie Weems' body, I saw a parallel, and I think it's quite striking, that karate that at some point leaves the building and sort of like suspended. And it seems that servant, that is the karate, sort of escapes the facade and then enters the landscape and starts altering images of the building and being placed in appropriate contexts and altering this purity of values that the critic Mark was citing, denounced this type of operation of just by moving one figure and changing the place, the position, the situation, a whole disruption can be operated. And Mark, what are your thoughts about?
Yeah. No, I thought it was. I mean, Mabel and I, we discussed a few things, but of course, each of our talks took a little bit different turn than oh, sorry. As usual, there's so much coordination over here that I thought was fantastic. The first thing I want to mention is Mabel's interest in Downton Abbey.
My obsession.
Mabel's obsession with Downton Abbey. I think that's very pertinent because, and I speak as someone who sadly has not seen enough of it, so I can't speak with any expertise. A couple episodes, and a couple fragments of it or so. But I imagine as in the upstairs downstairs genre, any of the upstairs downstairs genre, which is certainly what the ancient Roman comedies are, which is what the Renaissance comedies are. Is that those who think that they are in power are often rely on those who are not, and there's lots of everyone who's in this middle range, and they find their power slipping, and there are lots of middle men. So Castiglione, the Book of the Courtier, on the one hand, one of the speakers will talk about how courtiers should not mix with the lower classes, and the very next passage is talking about how courtiers are servants of the Duke. So suddenly the servant, they're in this middle position over here, and it seems to me that very much the middle position, where are you positioned, either in the kitchen table in the midst of that series of exchanges, or are you outside looking in at the museum? And I mean, it seemed very poignant that now suddenly she's the first one in 2014. So all of those series of being on the outside looking in, where are you? You're not totally outside. She's obviously someone in the midst, but where is she positioned in that way, and where is she positioned around the the private-public exchange of the table as a piazza in the family. She's no longer, she's certainly not the mammy, she's certainly not just the mother figure behind over here. She's in the midst, she's more engaged. And it seems to me that all of the photographs are trying to speak of this shifting positioning and spatialize that positioning. And that's what all the artists that I was showing was trying to do as well over here. And the difference is in any work of art and any building does that. It's just a question of which ones show you that they're enacting that they're doing that. And that's why I find so fascinating about all of the work of the people I showed over here. The work is not a static representation, it's an enactment of certain ambiguity that the artist has in relation to these issues. That's as true for Koulas as it is for Moretti, as it is for Palladio, as it is for Giulio Romano. No matter how successful they each were, they were still in this strange middle position in terms of their own culture, and that was enacted in the work itself, as in the work that you showed, for sure.
Well, I think in Moretti's case is very interesting how it becomes so visible that the monumental principles at work in some of the early projects in a way find their most critical and self-reflective moment in the domesticated or domestic space. One question I would like to ask Mabel about this very striking quote or thought, I don't remember well, but you spoke about the preservation of certain memory, certain documents for future memory, but also for future monuments, the monuments being in the future. You said memory of the future in anticipation of action to come, and how the monument is not for a nostalgic revision or looking for examples, but to precisely the opposite, give the future some tools and so on. And in this creation of future icons and the way Fred Douglass was aware of that through photography and how, for instance, photography could be used to produce new statues when the emancipation of African Americans would be a reality. All this type of thinking inevitably, because it's been a constant space of research for me, but it made me think of Afrofuturism and the way this sort of monumentality and a certain architectonics was implemented in these radical ideas of the future and emancipation in particular, well, emancipation/exile. And since you didn't mention that, but I saw some hints in some parts of your book, especially when W.E.B. Du Bois enacts this whole Egyptian performance. I would like you to maybe develop a little bit on that, if Afrofuturism is something that you may have considered or has an importance for you in regard to these issues.
No, that's actually a curious cosmic question, because I was having a conversation with a director of what's called Studio X in Johannesburg, and we're actually going to do some programming around Afrofuturism in Johannesburg, looking at South African artists, precisely around the question of how does one create a radical imaginary in a place like South Africa, particularly within the architecture community that seems to be bogged down with problem solving, rather than trying to really reimagining what that space might be, right? And so we were talking about Afrofuturism in that regard, and like what would the implications of that be, precisely because the term hasn't been linked back to the architectural implications of Italian futurism to begin with. I mean, it's typically talked about in terms of music and performance and art practices, but not necessarily within the architectural. So it's very funny that you asked that question. But what interests me, and again, this is kind of what I'm trying to unpack with this question of history, and this is why for me De Silva is a very interesting thinker in that regard, because she's essentially saying that the representative significations of history are precisely productive of racial difference. The modern subject can know the world precisely because there are others that can't and can't ever be included. And that history is a mode of interiorization of an understanding of temporality that is constantly productive of that, and the racial is a part of that. And so for me, the question of, I'm trying to understand, well, what is history if you're always going to be always already outside in that way? So there's that aspect of it. And then the question of like, well, then what is beyond that, which is potentially the future? And can that kind of moving beyond be another way of not necessarily being pushed backward, right? And so I'm interested sort of in that tension between like the future and what that implies, and you know, that sense of pastness implicated within history. But within you know, sort of African American history, even though blacks were granted emancipation and voting rights within the, I always forget the amendments that did this, right after the Civil War or prior to the Civil War, those rights were never granted. So even though people were celebrating liberation and emancipation, you were still not yet a citizen, right? So the celebrations were always what ought to be. That's why I like Faber's formulation rather than what is, the things that should be there, the rights that one should have. And you're not yet that subject. So it's always this kind of imagination of what the future subject, the future citizen, the future nation might be. And that was precisely why Du Bois has this performance, The Star of Ethiopia, to begin to imagine like what that might look like, how that might be performed, precisely when you're constantly told you're not human, you're not a citizen, you have no rights, you can't work, you can't, you know, that you're always being excluded. And so, I don't know, the future was posited, I think, in a very sort of interesting and productive and critical way as a kind of resistance to constantly being pushed backward, anyway, and literally out of the picture. And so, yeah, so the question of Afrofuturism, you know, is, I think, a really good one to think about in relationship, potentially, to...
Yeah, if I ask that, it's because also your sentence about the future and future action and monumentality and the documentary strategies to like feed future memory also made me think about these radical, futuristic or not, but radical imaginaries implementing the parametric mutations that Mark was speaking about, like, in a way, this way of monumentalizing the present as some sort of message sent to the future sort of pushes the subject in question, architect or artist or musician or whatever, into this parametric mutational thinking. And I don't know, Mark, if you would like to develop on that.
Sure. You know, for me, and there's so many issues to talk about there. For me, it's a pretty Brechtian point, meaning that in order to get to the future, you have to be able to operate on the present. You have to be able to see that the present is not a matter of facts, but that those facts are mutable. And you operate them on them very precisely. You don't try to escape from them. I'm going to tell my usual bad pun over here, apropos to the Egypt question I'm going to talk about in a minute, but the Nile ain't just a river in Egypt. That rather than deny the present in order to skip ahead to the future, that in order to get there, you have to undo the present. You have to find that it's mutable and that it's operable. In order to do that, sometimes you have to take a step back. And so that's why, and I didn't really do justice to the quote of Rem Koolhaas. It was kind of a shocking quote about, I had to figure out the Renaissance. I had to go back, and I was shocked by Laurentian Library. I found it shocking. I found that his ability to, and he's a little sloppy on his history, but it's fine, totally fine, because if he gets people to look back there, it's fine, doesn't matter, it has to be so exact, but you know, that he's breaking all the rules. In fact, Michelangelo is not breaking the rules, he's very much taking the classical rules that are being established here for national identity. I want to say that there's always identity questions over here. In other words, and it's a problem, and identity is like a huge problem here, just as it is with Egypt being in Afrofuturism. It's a problem because on the one hand, you want to establish yourself with an empire, with a civilization, with a culture that is highly sophisticated. But for Raphael and Giulio and Michelangelo, this is a pagan culture. And that literally, I'll exaggerate and say, they're responsible for the Reformation in some way, because them going back to antiquity and using these mythological characters, not here in a private villa, but in liturgical space, was a real problem for Calvin and for Erasmus and all those other guys. So in a certain way, they're responsible for this big explosion that happens. And so these attempts at identity, but they're very conflicted about them. So there's an amazing moment where even though Castiglione has written this letter to Raphael saying to Leo X, we've got to go and measure the antiquity, we've got to reestablish an Italian identity against the North, against the Goth, against medievalness. A few years later, for Bibbiana's comedy, he'll write a preface which says, some of you the audience, in other words, the prologue, the person will come out on stage, and some of you will accuse the author of stealing from Plautus and Terence, but if you go and look if you look in Plautus, you'll see that nothing is missing. The author didn't take us so much as that. In truth, he borrowed characters and plots, but there's nothing missing. So if you have a problem, please don't tell the police over there. If you've got a problem with that, go whisper it in Plautus's ear. This is an amazing both evocation of this past and a distancing from that past at the same time. So these people, and you see this enacted in Giulio's work, and you see it enacted in Michelangelo's work. He is not breaking the rules. He's simultaneously, like Brecht, establishing what the rules are and showing that they're operable. That can lead to a different kind of future. So how that works in terms of Egypt and Sun Ra and Afrofuturism and the way in which Egypt becomes both a necessary kind of condition to evoke, but also a problem, as it is not, it is not your past. I think it's interesting the way that then gets played out.
All right, I'm going to pass the mic along to some of our friends here.
Excuse me. I actually think that the presentations were, in every sense, compatible, but also I'd like to oppose them in the following sense, that I think Mabel was dealing with the problem of the subject, and I think Mark was dealing with the problem of the character. And I think that those two things are not the same thing, that the idea of the subject from the standpoint of an architectural system that subjugates, or I mean, it's both related to the power of architecture, so to speak, that in the Carrie Mae Weems photographs, in a certain sense, they're about a kind of deep subjectivity or subjectification of those who watch and so forth, those who observe, the observer, but also those who are forced to, who are controlled by a kind of static totalitarianism of, as you were saying, the control not only of the past and the present, but also of the future. So, whereas it seems to me in Mark's thinking about the monumentalization, that it is monumentalization is one tool among many available to a monumental practice like architecture that is constantly trying to present a sort of its own, a character, to enact a characterization of its social condition, and never can summarize that even in those those buildings that don't show the characterization, but the characterization is at work all the same. And so the difference between the character and the subject is mutability versus stasis, or the animation versus, the subject is a huge, obviously, thing that we understand about identity, that we are made subjects by governments and so on. But I do think that I'd like to hear you both sort of see whether those things are really the same. Are they even in the same ballpark? I mean, I think Carrie Mae Weems sees the buildings themselves as a kind of force just unto themselves, and wouldn't see that character, the play of character in them that actually makes them escape the field of the totalitarian in such a way that you could have a future. In other words, you wouldn't necessarily, the future wouldn't necessarily have already been predetermined by, by those who are controlling who's excluded and who isn't. So I think that there's something going on there. I mean, I think you're right about her relation to photography. She's related to photography the same way, let's say, Mark is talking about being related to architecture, but her relationship to architecture is that it stands outside that play. And so I think that, I think those are very different worlds.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what I am interested in is the question of subjection, but what I'm also trying to, again, sort this out, and this is part of the larger formulation, I think, of building race and nation, right? Which is why I want to put those two things together in that book, is that there's the building, which is both the act, the building that is the thing, right? And there's the nation that is the social, and the racial that is a kind of force or analytic category that is productive, right, of certain things. And I'm interested in what ways is that space that exists where representation, where subjects, emerging subjects engage with these representations, which is why I showed those images of Durand and the knot and the glidden. And those representations that are just actively producing, a knowledge about racial difference at this particular moment in the 19th century. And the fact that you could have and know man in that way and presume that man is this universal thing that everyone's going to slot into, and that there's something about that space of the table in which everything can be organized and represented and mapped, that I think architecture in some way also is appearing within that in some way. And I'm interested in what that is actually producing, or particular kinds of subjectivities that that's producing in that engagement, in that play of it. So I think character's in there, but it's not the subject. They're not the same thing, but it's kind of like, it's a production, it's a productive relationship of particular kinds of subjectivities.
Does racial difference, as you say, the production of racial difference, which is absolutely correct, I think, over and over, is that equivalent to the relation of the enslaved person? I mean, is that even in the same world as the enslaved person? I don't think of an enslaved person as a subject. I think of an enslaved person as literally, an animal that, it's been rendered as a beast in some way that can be shut down, So.
Which precisely depends on if that human body is understood as property, which isn't to say that slaves didn't have subjectivities, right? Which they did outside of even being, in the role of the enslaved. There was a certain subjectivity that existed in a way, but the degree to which that subjectivity could be sort of recognized and empowered within this larger frame of representation of the nation, right? That's the thing that I'm going to try to figure out in this book. But I feel like there's also something in the way in which Weems is working that is bringing up that question, right? In a way.
I'll respond briefly. What I liked about Mabel's answer was summarized, when she was going like this, because I think there is a kind of back and forth. The slave problem is already in these Roman comedies, the ancient comedies, and that's why it's really interesting that Plautus will literally, it's the use of the word architect for the slave. He's the one who constructs the plots in both sense, the plot of the whole play, but also the dealings, the underhanded dealings, in order to fool the braggart master. So it's, and And that's what's so intriguing to see in the book of the courtier, which, these are people that are high up in the court, but they still feel themselves to be the servant. And that's why the word domestic becomes a question, just like with slave, are you a property of the house? Whose property, and whose property of who? And of course, this is Catherine's work right now, a book on property. So this is all within that question. And I think that these architects, all of whom are beholden, Giulio Romano is beholden not only to the papal court, but then he's beholden to the Duke Gonzaga, Federico Gonzaga, are definitely this middle question of subjectness. They are character within the play, but they're also, and they have their own subjectivity within that, but they are subject to. They're always subject to. Not just because there's a patron there, but because there's a whole social field. And what I was claiming in the work is that each of these architects manifest these elements in their pictorial work or in their architectural work as elements within a larger tectonic field and social field that are both mutable. They have some agency. They have some, you can't call them subject to it, but they have some possibility of transformation, but they're still within a given field, and you can be meta to that, but still you're within that field. So it's definitely what Mabel was saying, like this.
Hi, thank you both for enlightening presentations. And this question is for Mabel. You spoke about, I'm going back to monuments, and I'm paraphrasing from your presentation. Monuments is visual evidence of culture. Photography does the same thing, but is more accessible to the masses to erect. So with that said, do you feel that monuments are still viable? Are there needs for monuments? If photography is like this new monument, do physical built architectural monuments still need to exist?
That's a very challenging, because obviously monuments are still being constructed. I mean, there's just one down the way that's enormous, billion-dollar, monument. Well, it's a memorial, but memorials can also clearly have a monumental function, and they're meant to provoke recollection, right, and remembrance.
So let's be specific and say we're African Americans.
Well, that's why I started with the Maya Angelou, who's essentially saying, precisely because, as a diasporic, peripatetic people that were always moving, this idea of, digging a hole, pouring a foundation, and leaving something permanent that will be there as if you will be there, for generations, somehow didn't hold true. And so this idea that you would pack with you what you could bring, the memories become the artifacts, or the stories or the narratives. That's what I think, Angelou was getting at with this idea of the blues, the song, the preacher, the story, that there's a kind of rhythm, but it's also a temporal rhythm in which the thing gets retold, and that becomes the way of remembering. And so it's a really good question. I mean, I've done this work on the African burial ground and made a proposal for the African burial ground. And one of the problems of the African burial ground was because it was literally outside the city. It had literally been erased off the map, so its representation didn't exist. The idea of putting a stone without a community to directly remember why it was there meant that it couldn't function. I mean, it literally couldn't function as a memorial. And I think what they've made is quite beautiful. But in a way, the struggle has always been to figure out, well, how is it going to be meaningful, and who will sustain it? And fundamentally, what we proposed was just a garden, that literally somebody had to tend the site in order to constantly be there and remember on a daily basis to be able to cultivate that sense of what this might mean in a way. And so it's this idea of return and a kind of presencing constantly, continually, that I think is important. But when you're constantly being pushed out of, forced to move, unable to stay, then your monuments become mobile, essentially. I mean, this is sort of what Manuel was saying about the mobile museum, of the International African American Museum in Detroit.
Maybe there is something interesting about your proposal for the burial, for the African American burial field, burial ground, sorry, that you decided not to erect a monument, and it's a little bit like there's too much noise around, and maybe silence is more singular, more heard than just one more voice. So in a way, I think your statement in that proposal kind of like implies already a proliferation of monuments, some sort of an overwhelming force of monumentalization all over the place. But maybe we have time for a last question.
This I'm trying to maybe find, well, incredible presentations, really dense with information for even me who should know some of this. But my last question, I guess, is about slavery and the construction of the work. And, Rome was built mostly, I would imagine, by slave labor, and this idea of who was actually constructing the monuments physically. And if you think that in the Renaissance, I guess slavery is still a social construct and an economic construct. And I think it's very interesting when you transport that to America, where it becomes a slave trade, and the plantations are a domestic, economic, agrarian system. So this idea of the domestic and the monument, and this intermingling then of the construction of these monuments as being actually constructed by the slaves. It's a bit like the separation wall being built by Palestinians, so I'm just wondering if maybe there's some comment about that or intersection. I know that's kind of Mabel's area, but I'll let you start.
Maybe? So. Okay. I mean, that is somewhat the crux of this book, Building Race and Nation, because I was interested in what way were the so-called founding fathers imagining freedom, liberation, democracy, right? What the republic would be when Washington, D.C. was deliberately placed between two slaveholding states, right? So there has to be, this ability to ponder, right? Here these are, and I want to sort of clarify what I mean by the modern subject as being self-determined and self-conscious, which means God does not give me my consciousness. My subjectivity is not determined by the king or the queen. I determine. I have my own self-will, and that's a really important development, I think, in modernity. Like the modern subject actually can, determine what originally he would have decided. And so here are these self-determining patriarchs, right? And they're in the midst of these slave-owning states, and they're imagining freedom, and yet the very people that are around them are not free, right? And so I was interested in this sort of dialectic between that realm, but also the ways in which the slave body literally becomes a technology, right? In order to sort of build and maintain the system of the trade, the system of of commerce that's operating within the Middle Atlantic states as well. Linking Richmond to Alexandria and Washington D.C. to Baltimore to Philadelphia, and sort of understand that whole milieu, but also to recognize that the slaves also had their own realm within those cities. There were freed people, there were slaves, and what was their space like within that context, in a way. So the question of, in the American context of enslavement and the sort of aesthetics of it, I think are a really good one. But I will say, this question is very contemporary, because what's going on in Qatar right now is exactly that problem. You have, buildings being built for the World Cup, for development in general in many parts of the world, and people are being brought in to work on contracts, but precisely because they don't have status as citizens, they aren't literally represented within the law, they have no rights and therefore are open to all sorts of exploitation. And so, that configuration is still persistent within global capitalism, which was preceded by industrial capital, mercantile, and in particular forms of engagement and exploitation. I think even persist to this day.
Just very briefly, and I'm going to keep it into the realm of these particular buildings rather than speak in general about the construction of Rome. It's really intriguing to me that Giulio Romano keeps representing workers and keeps doing these hybrid mixes between classes. And when he goes to Mantova and he not only is building all the Palazzo Te and the big works that he does there, but he's also overseer of the street is the term. He is the one who's coordinating all the revitalization of the city there. And Vasari mentions this, and the Duke, when the Duke dies and the Duke brother takes over, he says Giulio, is more the overseer of all of us because he knows everything about the city. The one little trace in Mantova of that institution is a gateway that is attributed to him, and in that gateway, in the arch, are depictions of workers with sacks loaded down within the arch. Not angels within the arch as usual, but and so it's intriguing to me. Does this mean that Giulio is a Marxist savant? I don't think we can. There's no evidence. It's a problem, and that's what I found so interesting about the work of these artists. They don't try to necessarily solve the problem. They're enacting the problem. They're performing the problem. They're putting it before us. Whatever their particular views of we may not know, it's, as I tend to say, we can never know the intentions of the artist. It's hard enough to know our own intentions. We can know the attentions in the object. And so it's intriguing to me, again, the caryatid in Palazzo Valmarana, which would seem to be, that's a standard fare, clearly is a problem. That support is for Milizia in the next century is terrifying. 2 centuries later, is how could you possibly what's this guy? He can't hold that up over there. It weakens the whole point. It's not strong. And by the time you get to Moretti, and with all the fascist brawny sculpture, and all you're left with is a little leg that's kind of actually wonky, and you don't know whether it's like torqued around facing the kneecap and the leg, and it's very What's that?
I said that is the creepiest thing.
Yeah. It is super creepy. I say it's the key to the building. It's really because it is this problem of identity, and it is this the construction of the state with whatever workers remains a problem. The fragments will create some construction, but they could also break apart, as Giulio showed us. So again, I'm just interested in the way in which that is an old problem, a really old problem, and everybody from a comedian like Plautus is worried about it from then till now. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for staying, for attending. Stay tuned for the next discussions. Once again, it's been a pleasure to have your company and to have Mabel and Mark here. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you very much. Have a good evening.